Good morning. It's so very kind of you to have invited me here this morning to share with you stories about my papa. I must confess he would be so embarrassed if he knew what I was about to do. He's such an humble man. But he, of course, is my very favorite thing in all the world to speak on. And I have so looked forward to coming here today and sharing these stories with you. So without further ado, I will begin with the beginning of Papa's life. Of course, he was born in Virginia. And his father was none other than Light Horse Harry Lee. And he was a great Revolutionary War hero and a dear friend of General George Washington. Well, my grandpapa Lee gave the eulogy at General Washington's funeral. First in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen. That's what he said. And my father's mother was the lovely Ann Hill Carter, the Carters of Shirley Plantation. Beautiful brick mansion on the banks of the James River near Petersburg, Virginia, with a large pineapple on top of the roof. Now, you probably know that's the symbol of Southern hospitality, which, of course, is what Colonel Lee came there expecting to find, as did all who visited with the Carters. But he also came there looking for a bride. You see, he had originally married the divine Matilda Lee of Stratford Hall Plantation, but she had passed away, leaving him with a small child. And he came there, I confess, to court one of the Carter cousins, but she was not very receptive to his advances. But my grandmother was swept off her feet by the handsome colonel. Oh. Now, her papa was not convinced this was a suitable match. I want you to understand that. You see, you know how papas are about the little girls to begin with, but my grandfather Lee had quite the reputation with the ladies. But papas also can't tell their daughters no for very long, and he did propose to her there in the parlor at Shirley. And she immediately tested her engagement ring on a pane of glass, and I'm very happy to report it passed with flying colors. Her initials are still on that pane of glass to this very day, along with those of other Carter girls who did the very same thing. And they were married in that very same parlor before returning to Stratford Hall as husband and wife. And of course, that's where the babies began to come. Now, Papa was the fourth born of five. He was the youngest boy. And there at Stratford Hall, he was born on a very cold and icy January day, January the 19th, in the year of our Lord, 1807. Now, my grandmother was very ill, and they feared for her survival through the delivery, but she rallied her strength, and she named this new arrival herself after her two favorite brothers. Now, I will say that it is most often the case that a papa will name a new arrival, particularly if he's a little boy. But my grandfather Lee was frequently away from the home. He was not a very good manager of money. I'm sure you'll understand if we don't speak on that again. And he was not present for Papa's arrival, so my grandmother named him Robert Edward after her two favorite brothers. And there at Stratford Hall, Papa grew to the very old age of 4, when the family did away to a new home in Alexandria, Virginia. Now, when I was a little girl there at Arlington House, we loved for Papa to tell us stories about when he was a little boy. And he would use those stories to teach us important lessons about being good little boys and girls. I'm sure your parents did the same. And we would sit at his feet there in the parlor and pull his boots off and tickle his feet while he'd tell us stories. He loved for us to tickle his feet. And if we got too involved in the story and we forgot to tickle, he'd stop and say, no tickle, no story. And we Lee children would resume our duty. But I remember him telling me this particular story about the day they left Stratford Hall. For he said it was the only day he ever disobeyed his mother. And I believe it to be true. You see, she had left him there by the carriage to go back in the house and retrieve a few last-minute items. You know how moving days are. And she told him to stay right there and wait for her return. But he was so afraid that leaving the only home he had ever known, he would never see his two dearest friends ever again. So when she went back into the house, well, he disappeared in right behind her to bid them farewell. Well, of course, when she returned to the carriage, she knew immediately where to go looking. Our mothers always know where our hiding places are. And she found him in the first place she looked. There in the little nursery, the little room there beside the mother's room, kneeling in front of the fireplace, just a wee little fireplace, just big enough to warm that little room, bidding those friends farewell. But I can see on your faces you're wondering what friends will be living in a fireplace. Well, they were the little cherubs on the backs of the fire dogs. They had been his guardian angels for all of his life. But obediently bidding them farewell, he went with his mother back to the carriage, and they did away to Alexandria. And there Papa did grow to young manhood. By the time he was 12 years old, he was the man of the house. My grandfather having taken himself to the West Indies for his health. I've heard it said there may have been other factors involved. But Papa was the man of the house by the time he was 12 years old. That means he was the keeper of the keys. Every morning he would come downstairs and he would unlock the pantry doors and he would take an inventory, and if all was required for the day's victuals, why, Papa took the baskets and the monies down to the market and securing those items and placing everything just so in its proper place. He then would go to his tutor's home for his instruction. For you see, as money was frequently in short supply in the Lee family home, my grandmother was in hopes Papa would receive his higher education at the expense of the federal government. And he was preparing for his entrance examinations to the United States Military Academy at West Point. Now, she did keep a weekly report of his progress to ensure that her monies were being spent effectively. She need not have worried. All of his professors said that Papa was a wonderful student. His mathematics instructor said that he was a great one for finishing up, that it was a shame to erase his conic sections from the slate board before the next problem could be placed there. And in the afternoons, when he returned home, he would go upstairs to his mother's bedroom. She was now quite an invalid and frequently confined to her bed. And he would scoop her up in his strong arms and carry her down to the waiting carriage. And they would go through the streets of Alexandria where she could bid a good day to friends and relations who lived there. We're related to everybody in the state of Virginia. If it was a cold and windy day, Papa would put newspapers in the cracks of the carriage so she would not take a chill. And he told her if she didn't smile, well, the exercise would do her no good at all. And I know she smiled a great deal, for her time with her son was drawing to a close. Papa received his appointment to West Point from none other than John C. Calhoun himself, the state's right senator from South Carolina. And as he prepared to leave her and go all the way to New York State, she told all who would listen, "Whatever shall I do without young Robert? He is both son and daughter to me." She was so very proud, and well, she should have been. Well, Papa went off to West Point. He graduated in the class of 18 and 29. Number 2 in that class in the academic standing. A very distinguished class it was as well, and I am here to tell you no one remembers who graduated number 1, but everybody remembers my Papa. Now, you know, of course, if you graduate at the top of your class, that's great bragging rights. But if you graduate at the bottom of the class, you just don't talk about that in polite society. But Papa was the highest ranking cadet in the military order. Everybody had to salute my Papa. And he was the only cadet that had monies left in his account. Now, I know he learned that frugality from his mother. He certainly didn't learn it from his Papa. But even more important than all of that, Papa was the only cadet to graduate without a single demerit to his record. And if you know anything at all about West Point, you get a demerit if your shoes aren't polished properly. Not a single demerit to his record. They called him the marble model. Now, my big brother Custis graduated number 1 in his class, 18 and 54, but he had 13 demerits to his record. Oh, and Papa loved to bring those demerits up at the most inopportune times. There we were in Lexington, Papa president of Washington College, and Custis now grown man teaching at Virginia Military Institute. And we would be gathered around the dining room table, and dignitaries had come from all over the world to see Papa there. And Papa would find some way to bring up those demerits. So embarrassing to Brother Custis. But, of course, when he returned home, it was to a sad time. My grandmother was in her last illness, and he nursed her through that last illness. He was holding her hand as she breathed her last on this earth. And although it was a sad time for Papa, it was an exciting time as well. Now he was a second lieutenant in the Army Corps of Engineers, a very elite part of the Army, I can assure you. And he had been given his first post to go all the way down to Savannah, Georgia, such a lovely city, Savannah. And there he was to finish draining Cockspur Island at the mouth of the Savannah River so they could finish building Fortress Pulaski out there. Oh, and he would tell us stories about being in the muck and mire all the way up to his armpits. I can't imagine Papa in such a nasty place. But he did love Savannah. He made many good friends, particularly among the children. Papa loved children. Children loved Papa. And he would draw them little pictures of terrapin turtles and even alligators he saw out in that swamp. But his heart was still in Virginia. Papa's heart was always in Virginia. And he had decided it was time for a wife and family of his own. Now, he had already selected the bride, but she did not yet know it. You see, when he was a little boy in Alexandria, he could look across the Potomac River up to Arlington Heights, overlooking the federal city. That's what we call Washington, D.C. in those days. And there on Arlington Heights was the lovely mansion built by none other than the child of Mount Vernon, George Washington Parke Custis. He and his lovely wife, Mary Fitzhugh, had several children, but only one had survived infancy. Little girl, they named her Mary Ann Randolph Custis. And she and Papa were of an age. And when he received permission from his mother, then he would cross over the Potomac and he and little Mariana would play together. And he got to know old man Custis real well. You see, that's what they called my grandpapa in the Federal City. He was just a fixture. He had not missed a single inauguration of a president, from his own grandpapa Washington straight down to President Buchanan. Oh, and he was the very centerpiece of 4th of July celebrations. I didn't know you could have 4th of July without my grandpapa. See, he had General Washington's field tent, and he would put it up from the Revolution. And he would put it up out on the front lawn of Arlington House and have the most wonderful fireworks displays you ever did see. When he passed away, I just knew they'd quit having the 4th of July in the Federal City, but they didn't. But Papa would go over there to play with little Mariana, and they became very dear friends. They planted 2 trees to commemorate their friendship, and to my knowledge, those trees are still there to this day. Now, when he went away to West Point, he continued to write to her, very clandestinely, of course. And now he returned to the portico of Arlington House, dressed in all of his military finery, to present himself as a beau for her hand in marriage. I understand the line was long and distinguished, but none of them as handsome as Papa. Mother was quite swept off her feet. Oh, all the ladies and gentlemen in the Army all agreed he was the handsomest thing they ever put on a uniform. Dark eyes, almost black, his hair curling, the little curls there above his collar. Oh, such a handsome man. Swept her right off her feet. Her mother was very agreeable to this match, but old man Custis, now there was another situation entirely, was this second lieutenant, regardless of how handsome he might be, a suitable match for his lovely daughter. Well, the courtship began, because papas can't tell their daughters no for very long, and Mother herself told me the day Papa proposed. It's a precious story I'm going to have to tell you. They were at the Fitzhugh family home, Chatham, on the banks of the Rappahannock River near Fredericksburg. And Mother was doing some needlepoint with her mother, and Papa was reading to him from Sir Walter Scott's novel Ivanhoe. Wonderful story about chivalry and duty, things so precious to Papa. Been reading for about 3 hours, Mother said. When her mother turned to her and said, "Mary, I believe young Robert could use a piece of carrot cake and a glass of lemonade from the kitchen." Well, being a dutiful daughter, she of course got up and went to retrieve those items, and being a perfect gentleman, Papa went along to assist. Now, my mother's a dear soul, and I love her very much, you understand, but she is quite clumsy. And as she was preparing that piece of cake, she dropped a fork on the flagstones, and when she knelt down to pick it up, Papa knelt beside her and proposed. Isn't that the sweetest thing? She said yes right there in the kitchen. She did. And they dashed back to the parlor to tell her mother, who gave her consent. All that was left was the old man. Well, I don't need to tell you, they got married. June the 30th, 1831 at Arlington House. An evening ceremony with a lovely archway of flowers from the Arlington Gardens, there between the dining room and the parlor. Oh, and Papa said the house was filled to overflowing. They came from every corner of Virginia, Custises and Lees and Carters and Fitzhughs. I told you we related to everybody. The last person to arrive was the minister, who in my experience is frequently the last person to arrive. And as the dear soul came up the carriageway, the heavens opened and the rain just fell in buckets. Wasn't a dry thread on him when he came in the house. But my grandpapa Custis is a very generous man, and he invited him back to his dressing room to secure some dry items of clothing. But Papa said when they emerged, it was all they could do to hide their snickers. You see, my grandpapa Custis is very short, very round. And the minister was very tall and very slender. The pants were too short, the sleeves were too short, but Papa said they all pretended not to notice. And the rest of the ceremony went off without further ado, except the menfolk were all looking at him as if they were about to read his funeral rites instead of his wedding vows. After a lovely wedding journey to friends and relations unable to attend the ceremony, they arrived at their first post together as husband and wife, Fortress Monroe, at the mouth of the James River, near Norfolk, Old Point Comfort's what they called it. And there, of course, the babies began to come. Now, there were 7 of us all told. All save the oldest was born back at Arlington House, because Mother said there was a time when a woman just needed her mama. But that very first baby arrived at Fortress Monroe, and it was a little boy, and Papa so wisely named him George Washington Custis Lee. But the name was longer than the baby was. But he knew if he named his first arrival after his father-in-law, that would finish softening the old man up. Oh, and it did do that. Grandpapa Custis loved Brother Custis so very much. But Papa knew that was far too big a name for a little boy. And he began the practice of giving us all our special names, our family names. Now, we don't know where he found his names, but the name Papa gave Brother Custis was Boo. And do you know, to this very day, if I need something from Brother Custis, I'll sit down on the settee real close and say, Boo, would you please help me? And he can never tell me no. The next child born was a little girl, and Papa named her Mary Custis Lee. And the confusion began immediately. See, my grandmother's name's Mary, and my mother's name's Mary, and now my sister's name is Mary, and Papa solved it all. He just called her daughter. And to this very day, when we need Sister Mary, we call her daughter. When we can find her, to call her anything. Well, she's always going hither and yon. We never know when we're going to hear from her. She's so stubborn and she's so hard-headed. She's full through and through, and I know why. You see, the government sent Papa out to St. Louis, Missouri to move the Mississippi River. And did you know? My Papa did move the Mississippi River. I have friends in St. Louis tell me that river's where Papa put it to this day. And if the government hadn't ended the funding, he'd have moved it further, and they'd never have to worry about that lovely city flooding out there. But he took Mother and the two oldest boys, and they left my sister Mary with the grandparents. Well, you know how grandparents are with the babies. I'm spoiled too. She is so hard-headed. She has not yet married. I don't think she ever will. I don't think there's a man that'll have her. I know that's a terrible thing to say about your sister, but perhaps you haven't met her. Now, when we were at West Point and Papa was superintendent, there was a cadet there, a dear friend of Custis, who was also at the Point at the time, and I'm sure you've heard of him. His name was James Yule Brown Stewart. We just called him Brother Jeb. He came so often we thought he was a member of the family every Sunday for luncheon. And he was courting my sister Mary. I know he was, because I was eavesdropping at the parlor door. But he went on to marry the lovely Miss Flora Cook of Virginia. He did tell an acquaintance that he did court the young Miss Lee, but escaped unscathed. If you knew my sister Mary the way I do, you'd understand what General Stewart was speaking on. Well, the next child was another boy. And Papa named him William Henry Fitzhugh Lee. Another very large name, but this one fits. Papa called him Rooney. That's the Irish word for darling. Rooney darling. Well over 6 feet tall, with large hands and large feet, and a heart to match. You won't find a kinder, gentler soul if you look the world over than my brother Rooney. But he is a big man. An acquaintance of his at Harvard College said, yes, he did know Mr. Lee and found him too large to be a man, too small to be a horse. Now, the next two were two little girls, and they were born 2 years apart. But they were so close in spirit, many thought they were twins, and they might as well have been. My sister Ann, that's the one Papa named after his mother. He called her Sweet Annie, or sometimes Little Raspberry. She had a birthmark on her cheek. And my sister Agnes, and Papa called her Wiggs or Wiggy. We truly don't know where Papa found that name. Now, she's the beauty of the family. She got Papa's eyes. I got Papa's nose. It looked just fine on Papa, but it's far too big for my face. And then there was another little boy. And Papa named him Robert Edward Lee, Jr., my big brother Rob. As a young man, he had a frequently reoccurring fever. And Papa changed his name to Robertus Siccus. See, Papa was fluent in Latin. But then in 1846, on February the 10th, I was born. And Papa named me Mildred after his sister Mildred, who had married Mr. Child and lived in Paris. I never met her, but they all speak so highly of her sweet spirit. I hope I'm a worthy namesake. But that was also the great year of the war with Mexico. And Papa left us, me just a little thing in a cradle, did not yet have my special name, and went all the way to Mexico. General Winfield Scott himself personally asked for Papa to be his chief engineer and chief of staff. And he was just a captain in the United States Army, because we hadn't had a war in forever. And there he left us to go all the way to Mexico. Now, I know Mother must have worried years off of her existence. Well, of course, Papa wrote to us, told us some of the most amazing things, but he wouldn't tell us of the dangers he was in. But we had friends in the War Department, and they told Mother the most amazing things. How General Scott mentioned Papa in every dispatch he sent back to the government. He called him the finest soldier he had ever seen in the field. He called him the indefatigable Lee, and I'm not sure what that means, but I think it means Papa never got tired. And he was promoted in every battle in which he fought. He left as a captain, came home a colonel. Oh, and the day Papa came home. Now, I was just 2 years old, you understand. I don't remember it, but you'll see it was a very important day for me, and I've been told the story so often, I declare I do remember it. Now, Papa was to arrive by the rails back in Alexandria, and Mother was to send a carriage to retrieve him. But my mother's never been on time for an engagement in her entire life. And my papa's the only man I ever knew to make a train ride on time. Mother was late and he was early. He had to lease himself a horse to come home to his family. And when he came up the carriageway, the only thing on the plantation that recognized him was our little dog Speck. Well, you may well laugh, but my papa and that dog were very close. He found Speck's mama floating in New York Harbor when he was there building Fortress Hamilton. And when he brought her on board the little ferry boat he was on, she was expecting puppies. And we gave all the puppies away, save one, little Speck, just a little bitty, tiny little white dog, little black dots all over him, hence Speck. And he went with us everywhere. He even went with us to church. On one Sunday, we arrived at Christ Church there in Alexandria, and it was so cold and so windy. I was so afraid that little Speck would be just frozen when we got out of church, because you know how long and windy those preachers are. And so I let him get up under my skirts and come in the church with us. I didn't see what harm could come of it. We had one of those pews that had a little door on it. I didn't know he was going to sit there and bark through the whole service. Papa was mortified, and he declared that Speck had never come to church with us again. So the very next Sunday, as we assembled at the carriage, he scooped that little dog up in his arms and took him to an upstairs bedroom and locked the door.
Oh.
We got in the carriage and we were away to the ferry. Little Speck was a resourceful dog. Someone had left the window open. It was not me. But he jumped out of that window and down onto the lawn, and he must have been a good swimmer. When we got to the church, he was sitting on the steps waiting. And Papa said that Sunday, if little Speck wanted to come to the Lord's house, he was not the man to stand in his way. He could ride in the carriage, but he could never come back in the church again under my skirts. He'd make me lift my hem so there's a little puppy dog tail on him. But of course, when Papa came in the house, Mother recognized him, although he was more handsome than ever, she said. I don't know how that would be possible. But he had grown a mustache and a little graying around the temples. And he embraced Mother, and he shook hands with Brother Custis, who had outgrown the age of embracing. You know how boys are. But he looked at Mother and he said, "Where's the baby?" He hadn't seen me since I was just a little thing in the cradle. And I was running about as only a rambunctious 2-year-old can do. And he scooped me up in his strong arms and he held me tight and he said, "This is the most precious bundle of life I have ever seen." And from that time on to my Papa, that was my name. Life. Precious life. He said as long as I was in the house, he didn't need sunshine. He would start his letters to me, "Dear precious life." And I ended all of mine to Papa, "All my love, your precious life." I remember the last time I ever heard him call me that. He was on his way to that vestry meeting, and if I had known it was the last time I'd hear that sweet voice, I'd have thrown my arms around him. I'd never let him walk out the house. But it was wonderful to have Papa home. I loved to write to Papa when he was away, of course. Now, he said it took a family, or a convention or a committee meeting to decipher my handwriting. Apparently, it was atrocious. That was Mother's word, not his. But I loved to write to Papa, and I loved to keep pet cats when I was there at Arlington. And I named them all Tom. Well, I thought that kept down on the confusion. You just call Tom and all the cats come running. And I loved to write to Papa all of the stories and things that my little cats would do. And I remember I got a letter from him from Texas, and he wrote to me and said that his pet snake had passed away after refusing his daily meal of frogs. Could I please send him one of my kittens in my next letter? And I tried, but that kitten didn't want to go to Texas. Could never find an envelope that would induce that kitten to go to Texas. But when we were living in Richmond in the latter days of the war, it was very hard for us to have a pet of any kind. But I was out and about one morning taking my exercise on Franklin Street, and I found a little baby squirrel. And that's our family mammal. Our motto is not unmindful of the future. Hence the squirrel, always mindful of gathering his nuts for the winter. And he seemed amenable, so I induced him to come home with me. I was a wonderful pet for the Lee family. Well, I knew Custis had not yet left for his office at the War Department, so I knocked on his door and I said, "Boo, would you please help me?" Well, of course he couldn't tell me no. And we found a little bird cage that no longer had an occupant. We made it into a little home for my pet squirrel. Little prison there for our pet squirrel. I named him Custis Morgan. Custis after Brother Custis, of course, and Morgan after John Hunt Morgan, the Confederate partisan ranger escaped from that nasty Yankee prison up in Ohio. And I named him that because the squirrel kept escaping from his little prison in our parlor. And I'd write to Papa all the antics of Custis Morgan. But Papa was fearful that being a wild thing, he might bite my mother, who was now confined to a rolling chair. I didn't tell Papa the squirrel had already bitten Mother's doctor twice. But he wrote to me in March of 1864 during that awful war. And he said, "Dear precious life, I do believe if the next time you give Custis Morgan his bath, if you'll hold his head under the water for an extra 10 minutes, it'll solve all your problems. I'll tell me to drown that squirrel. Well, of course I didn't do it, but I think the squirrel read Papa's letter. He disappeared 2 weeks later. We never saw Custis Morgan again. A friend of mine in Richmond declared he was a Yankee spy, taking his information back to the Union lines. But I am here to declare the Lee family would not have harbored a Yankee spy in the very bosom of our home. He read Papa's letter. He left while he could. Oh, but to have Papa home, oh, it was so wonderful, you see, because he would wake us up in the morning tickling us until we screamed for him to stop. He was teaching the boys how to ride their horses and for Sister Mary to ride a side saddle and to leap over obstacles there on the lawn of Arlington House. It was wonderful to have Papa home. He taught us all sorts of words in Spanish. He had learned to speak a great deal of it, being, of course, the Chief of Staff for General Scott. And he told the War Department in 1848, just right after he came home, that the day would come when every American would need to speak Spanish. Now, I can't imagine that day coming, but perhaps you can. But my favorite game to play with Papa, wherever the Army had sent him and he would come home, my favorite game of all was a game Papa called Strategy. Now, he would take each of us 7 children to a different room in Arlington House. And he would put us in that different room and he would tell us to be very still and very quiet. And to stay very still and very quiet until our Papa came back to get us. Because if we weren't very still and very quiet, well, the Indians would get us. Friends, sometimes I would sit there now on 3/4 of an hour, and that is very hard for a little girl, waiting on my Papa. I was a young woman before I realized that was Papa's way of having time alone with my mother. You have 7 children all want time with their Papa. They didn't have time for a cup of tea. It was not long after that that the Army sent him up to West Point to be the superintendent. Now, it was wonderful for the family. We, of course, all went with him. We lived there in the superintendent house, and Brother Custis was a cadet, and Jeb Stewart was there, and Cousin Fitzhugh, Uncle Sidney Smith's boy. Now, there was his uncle, the superintendent, didn't know what a demerit was because he never got one. Cousin Fitzhugh had enough for the whole cadet corps to share. Papa was so afraid he'd have to dismiss his own nephew from the point, but he marched all of those demerits off, and he graduated with his class. And then the Army sent Papa back to Texas. Ooh, hot, dry, nasty Texas. I remember Annie and Agnes were in school in Stanton, Virginia at the time, and Agnes wrote to him. It was a particularly hot year, and she wrote to him saying that it was too hot in the hills of Virginia. Could she please come home to Arlington House on the banks of the river to help take care of Mother? She just thought it was going to be cooler down there on the river. But Papa, who was very intent on our education, he wrote to her, and she let me read the letter. He said, "Dear Wiggy, if it's too hot for you there in Virginia, you just come on down here to Texas, tend to your Papa. I'm writing you at the noon hour. It's 110 degrees in my tent, and the candle is melting in the candlestick. If it's too hot for you in Virginia, you come on down here to Texas." But she stayed in school in Stanton. Apparently it wasn't as hot as she thought at first. In 1857, that was a sad year. That was the year my grandpapa Custis died. And Papa was the executor of his estate. And he came home to find out his father-in-law had been no better manager of money than his own Papa had been. So 1 year's leave from the Army turned to 2. And that's how it was in 1859. I was seated there on the steps of the portico surrounded by all the Toms there at Arlington. And I saw a great cloud of dust coming up the carriageway. And suddenly there before me, as if he and the animal were one, was Lieutenant Jeb Stewart, just starting to grow that beard we all remember so well. And he got down off that horse and bowed to me as only Jeb Stewart could do. And he dashed in the house. Well, before I knew what had transpired, one of our people brought Papa's horse round. He came out on the portico in his civilian clothes, he called them. I remembered it distinctly because he was so handsome in that uniform. Put his hat on his head, kissed me on the cheek, and said, "Precious life, I'll be back as soon as I can," and they were gone. Well, I rushed in the house and said, "Mother, where's Papa off to?" And she said, "Well, there's a crisis in the western counties of Virginia. The War Department sent your Papa to tend to it. He'll be back as soon as he can." Well, I kept watch by the clock. He was home within 36 hours. I said, "Papa, what's happened?" He said, "Precious life, you pay it no mind, and Papa's taking care of everything." Well, friends, you probably know that's when that madman John Brown took over that whole little town of Harper's Ferry. Now, I understand Harper's Ferry is in a state now called West Virginia. Apparently, it was permissible for Western Virginia to secede from Virginia during the unpleasantness But it was not permissible for Virginia to secede from the Union. And we'll just have to have another meeting to talk about that. But told me to pay it no mind. Well, of course, our troubles were just starting. Papa went on back to Texas. It was the year 1860. That was the year of that awful presidential election. I do hope we don't have another one like that. Of course, we women folk couldn't vote, but Papa insisted we all know what was transpiring, and we all knew there were 4 men running for president, and not a single state in all the Union had all 4 men on the same ballot. There was Mr. Lincoln from Illinois, there was a Mr. Douglas from Illinois, and a Mr. Breckinridge from Kentucky, and a Mr. Bell from Tennessee. Now, I knew Papa was going to vote for Mr. Bell. He called him a compromise candidate. You see, South Carolina threatened to secede if Mr. Lincoln was elected. And Papa knew that wasn't the answer to the country's troubles. He loved the Union. He had taken an oath to defend it. His Papa had fought to establish it. The man he idolized above all mortals on this earth, George Washington, was the father of that discovery. But of course, you know Mr. Lincoln was elected. And South Carolina seceded prior to the Christmas days of 1860. And after the first of the year, 6 more states, the Cotton States, the Deep South States, Cotton States, we call them, they seceded and formed the Confederacy, Confederate States of America. But Virginia had not yet determined her course, as North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas had not yet determined. But I knew, as young as I was, as Virginia decided, so would Robert E. Lee. You see, he loved Virginia more than anything else on this earth except in his life and his family. That's the way his mother had raised him. It's the way he raised us. And after Fort Sumter was fired upon and Mr. Lincoln called for volunteers to form an army to put down a rebellion, General Winfield Scott, now the commander-in-chief of all the forces, sent to Texas for Papa to come home. And Papa was offered command of that army to go put down that rebellion, and Papa knew that army would march through Virginia, and Virginia would not stand for it, as indeed she did not, and she seceded from the Union. Papa sent a letter of resignation to General Scott, except in defense of my home state, I hope never again to draw my sword. And then Papa thought he'd just come home to Arlington and he'd be a farmer, but of course he was not to be. We were coming out of Christ Church the Sunday after the secession of Virginia, and there were 3 finely dressed men. We knew they were from Richmond, you could just tell. Met Papa there by the carriage and told him that Governor Lecter wanted to see him in Richmond, and he left Arlington on April the 21st, and he never returned. He sent word to Mother that we would need to find another place to live. General Scott also sent word to my mother that the Union Army would occupy Arlington. She had very little time, and we rushed to secure the Washington memorabilia, the Lee memorabilia, those precious things to our family, and we became homeless, living at the behest of friends and family. Thank goodness we're related to everybody in Virginia. But now, you know the service of my family in that unpleasantness. Papa was commander of the Army of Northern Virginia. Custis was an advisor to President Davis. Rooney was a cavalry officer with Jeb Stuart, and Rob was an artillerist in the Rockbridge Artillery. I served for a time as a nurse after the Battle of Ball's Bluff, but Papa said it wasn't fitting for me to see such things, and insisted I go on back to school at Miss Powell's Academy in Winchester, Virginia, right in the very heart of the Shenandoah Valley. That poor little town had so many armies in and out of there during that war, they didn't know what flag to fly from the courthouse. But he knew precious life would be perfectly safe in the Shenandoah Valley as long as there was a general nearby by the name of Stonewall. When General Jackson was called to Richmond for the 7 Days campaign, Papa moved me to school in Raleigh, North Carolina, St. Mary's Academy. And I stayed there until 1863. Told Papa I'd learned everything I needed to know in school. Could I please come home to Richmond to tend to Mama? And he gave his consent. And that's why I was there the day the city fell. We were in church service on April the 2nd. The preacher was in the midst of his sermon, and suddenly he fell silent, which was very unusual. I looked behind me to my right. Davis' family pew was there. And I saw a telegram delivered to Mr. Davis. And he rose quickly, and followed by the other members of the cabinet in attendance, they departed. When the service concluded, I rushed home to tell Mother what I'd seen, and My mother's a very wise woman. She correctly surmised that Papa had abandoned his lines at Petersburg. The end was upon us. And we watched that afternoon as the boys in gray left our city. I hope you never see such a thing. I feared so, not for myself and my family. No one would have harmed the general's family. But I feared for the good people of Richmond. They had suffered so much. And with those soldiers went the last vestiges of law and order. We watched out the back windows. We could see the south bank of the James, where the warehouses were, as the Confederate soldiers set them alight. You see the rail lines had all been cut. We didn't want the Yankees to get everything. They set fire to it. And we feared that the wind would blow the sparks to the north bank of Richmond. The next day, the boys in blue came to take their place. And we heard a pounding on our door, and my sister Mary, who fortunately was at home, opened that door, and there stood a Yankee officer and two of his soldiers. Well, he came in the parlor, and he bowed very gallantly to my mother. Didn't know the Yankees could be gallant. And he said, "Mrs. Lee, we're here to take you and your daughters to safety. Please pack your things." Well, my mother looked at him and said, "I will not go." I had heard my mother use that tone of voice before, but that Yankee had not. And he tried again. He said, "Mrs. Lee, we're here to take you and your daughters to safety. Please pack your things and come with me." It was out of respect for Papa he was doing this. But my mother said a second time, "I will not go." And I was starting to feel sorry for that Yankee. But he tried valiantly once again. "Mrs. Lee, you're not under arrest. We'll take you wherever you want to go. But the city is not safe. The wind is against you. It's going to burn down around you, Miss Lee. Please get your things." My mother said a third time, "I will not go." And this time the Yankees surrendered to my mother. But he left those two soldiers on our front stoop, which again was a very gallant gesture, I believed. We watched out the back windows as the sparks crossed the James River and the north bank of Richmond began to burn. Mother sent Sister Mary out on the front stoop with a bucket of water. Now, what my mother thought my sister Mary, stubborn as she is, and a bucket of water could do against the flames of Richmond, I assure you I do not know. But I will tell you that the house across the street from us burned to the ground and not one spark struck our house. Even the flames of Richmond obey my mother when she uses that tone of voice. Papa arrived back after the surrender at Appomattox. He came back to Richmond on April the 15th. It was a Saturday morning. We had just received word of Mr. Lincoln's demise. Custis was already back with us after his parole from Sailor's Creek. Rooney was with Papa. I could see him on his horse. But we didn't know where Rob was. Had not heard from him in days. The street and the lawn in front of the little house there on Franklin Street was filled to overflowing. Most of them boys in blue come to see the general. It was a soft rain that day when Papa rode up on Traveler, that beautiful gray horse. I do declare they could talk to each other. And I wanted to run outside and throw my arms around him, but Mama said no, it wouldn't be fitting. So I watched. You could not hear a sound outside our house. Papa got down off Traveler and walked up to the stoop, and he took his hat off and he bowed to the crowd and came into the bosom of his family. The crowds lingered and they came back day after day after day. But Papa didn't want to be seen. Very gently, Custis would turn away people who came to the door to see him, except that rare soldier who just wanted one more glimpse of their general. In the evenings after the crowds had dispersed, Papa would put on his greatcoat and I would put on my cloak and we would walk through the streets of Richmond. He didn't talk much, but that was fine by me. I was just so glad to have him home. He did go out once during the day, went to get a haircut, and as he was seated in the barber's chair with the little children of Richmond, they all knew him. Had their little faces pressed up against the glass. And when he had settled his accounts and left the establishment, they all dashed in and started picking up locks of Papa's hair. He came home and said, "Precious life, I don't understand why they'd do such a thing." And friends, he sincerely did not, but I did. That was still the last public haircut my Papa ever had. Agnes Rye Woman cut his hair in the parlor from that time on, but we would save the clipping. And for years after that awful war, we'd get letters from all over this country, north and south, announcing the arrival of a new Robert E. Lee and the name of a proud papa, could they have a memento with the lock of hair in an envelope, Papa never knew. He was named president of Washington College. Little Presbyterian school, we were Episcopals, but we went to Lexington anyway. And Little Presbyterian school in Lexington, Virginia, right beside a Virginia Military Institute. Papa was named the president. Only 90 boys returning. Papa wasn't sure that he wanted to do that, but Judge Brockborough said it was his duty, and duty was a very special word to my papa. 90 boys returning. Black Dave Hunter had come through and burned the library and the science building, but Papa went to do his duty. When he passed away last year, there were over 400 boys at that school, and Papa could call every one of them by name. You had one meeting with the president when you arrived at the campus. You hoped it was your last. Papa would tell all the boys, we have but one rule here: you will conduct yourself as a gentleman. And he kept a weekly report of their academic progress, just as his mother had. And if it was not what he deemed acceptable, you got invited back to meet with the president. And he would remind them of the sacrifices their parents, many of them widowed mothers, you understand, were making for them to be there. That's all it would take. And Papa loved Lexington. I must confess I found it to be a rather boring little town, but my sisters and I, we did make a reading society. And Papa said it was devoid of any of the evils of literature. He thought we just meant to talk and drink tea. But we did read a few books. But Papa would come home from his office early on the days of the reading circle, and he would go through the rose garden. Now, wherever there was Mary Lee, Robert Lee planted roses. And he would pick a rosebud for every lady in attendance. And he would go in the kitchen and put a tea cozy on his head. Now, I don't know if you know what a tea cozy is for, but it doesn't go on your head, it goes on your teapot. But he would put it on his head and dance into our parlor and distribute his roses and dance back out again to Mother's mortification and my delight. That doesn't sound very much like a general, does it? But that's my papa. Oh, and I remember one day particularly, he came up from his office. Now, he and Custis designed the president's house with a large veranda so Mother could go out in a rolling chair. And they designed a beautiful ecumenical chapel on the campus. Papa said his greatest desire was that all the boys be Christian. And it was not required, but all the boys came because they knew Papa was going to be there. He never missed one. Sat on the first pew on the right as the minister looked out over the assembly. And each of the ministers in the little village of Lexington took it in turn, the Baptist and Presbyterian and Episcopal, you understand. And they would bring a little devotion, and then the day would start. Well, on this particular day, Papa was coming up for his lunch, and now you could set your pocket watch by him. Now, quarter of the hour of 8 at his office. The devotion was at 8:15. Papa came home at a quarter of the hour of 2 for his luncheon, and at 2:15 he took a wee nap. Well, I played the piano, and Agnes would rub his arm. He loved for us to rub his arm. We were past the age of tickling his feet, you understand. And then at 2:30 he would take his afternoon ride on traveling. Oh, but this particular day, he was coming up for his luncheon, and I was standing on the veranda, and that beautiful smile on his face, it turned to a grin, and then he was laughing. I said, Papa, what's so funny? He said, there's been an attempted murder at the campus. Well, I said, Papa, there's nothing funny about murder. Well, he called us all in the parlor to tell the tale, and it seems that when he arrived at his office door that morning, quarter of the hour of 8, there stood a very agitated professor declaring someone had tried to kill him. Well, Papa asked to hear the tale, and it seems when he put a stick of wood on his wood fire that morning to knock the chill from the room, it exploded with a great smell of gunpowder. Someone tried to kill him. Well, Papa knew him to be an amiable sort. He couldn't imagine someone attempting on his life, but that morning after the devotion was concluded, Papa stood and announced there'd been an attempted murder. Anyone having information, meet the president in his study. And when he arrived at his office door, there stood 2 very frightened boys from Tennessee. And he asked to hear their story, and it seemed someone was stealing wood from the student woodpile. And they surmised that they took a piece of wood and hollowed out a part and put gunpowder in it and sealed it over. The explosion would reveal the thief. How were they to know it was the servant for the faculty that was stealing the wood? They didn't mean to hurt anybody. Papa looked at him very sternly. He was using that general's voice. I can just hear him. He said, gentlemen, your idea was a sound one. Next time, use less powder. But not all afternoons were happy afternoons. One day when he came home from his ride, he looked particularly sad, and I said, Papa, whatever's the matter? He said, precious life, you know, I've told you about that beautiful old oak tree on my ride I pass almost every day. Large, stately, King of the forest oak trees, what Papa called it. But it was now dead, he believed, from the shot and shell of Black Dave Hunter's artillery. A constant reminder of the destruction of the war. On that particular day, the lady who lived at that house had met Papa at the end of her carriageway. And he knew she was angry. He could see on her face. He stopped Traveler to speak to her, as was his custom. And she pointed at the tree and she said, "General Lee, what will we do about this?" I said, "Papa, what'd you tell her?" He said, "Precious life, I told her to cut it down. I told her to cut it down." Papa had left the war behind him. It was time for new beginnings. We live in a great country. He told all who would listen, vote, be an American, and never regret the sacrifices you've made for your country. You've been a delightful audience. I'm going to leave you with my favorite memory of Papa. His dearest friend in all of Lexington was a little 9-year-old boy named Carter Jones. His Papa was the Baptist preacher, and every day it was Dr. Jones' responsibility for the devotion. He came with his Papa, and he sat with my Papa, just like a little soldier, shoulders back, just as straight as he could be, looking up at Papa. On graduation day, he arrived with his mother and came in the back doors there of what's now called Lee Chapel. And he looked for Papa in his accustomed place, but of course, being the president, Papa was not on the pew, he was on the dais. Well, little Carter broke from his mother, dashed to the front of the room, climbed up on the stage, and not finding a chair, he just sat down on the floor beside Papa and began to chatter away. His mother was devastated. She rushed to the front to retrieve her runaway child, and Papa waved her away. He said, "No, you leave him be." Well, friends, I couldn't take my eyes off of little Carter. He sat there just as still as a mouse, just like a little soldier with his shoulders back, look up at Papa every now and then, but the perfect little gentleman, until his head got so heavy and his eyes got so heavy and he just nodded his little head over on Papa's knee and went sound asleep. Well, eventually the speaker concluded, you know, they go on and on, nobody ever remembers a word they say, but eventually he concluded, whereupon the president was to rise and to deliver the diplomas, but Papa knew if he got up, he'd wake up little Carter. Well, that day at Washington College, the diplomas were delivered by the president from a seated position, and little Carter slept through the entire thing. You have been a delightful audience, and I thank you so much for your attention. I bid you respect.